Hello, I'm Dr. Elon Dancy. I serve as Executive Director for the Center for Urban Education and the Helen S. Faison Endowed Chair in Urban Education in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. If you are just joining us for the first time, the Center for Urban Education's mantra is learn, share, and transform. Learning speaks to the center's many programs in research, scholarship, and teaching. Share speaks to our efforts to share what we know and provide forum for our colleagues to do the same. This event, for instance, upholds that principle. Sharing also refers to a vision of mutual aid that is important to us. Transform speaks to our purpose. We are interested in transforming education structures towards self-determination, justice, and freedom. This requires intervention in power and power relations. The Lunch and Learn Public Talk is an initiative that engages our mantra, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our first Lunch and Learn of the fall semester, Censorship and the Attack on Critical Race Theory. In September 2021, I had the opportunity to join Dr. Gretchen Givens Generett, Dean of the School of Education at Duquesne University here in Pittsburgh, and YWCA Greater Pittsburgh Center for Race and Gender Equity for their Action Conversations on Race series. The focus was on the attack on critical race theory and what this means for schools and schooling in the US and Pittsburgh. In many ways, this discussion continues a focus on education as a practice of freedom, a conversation that the center introduced last month with our colleagues in the School of Education for our Practices of Freedom Symposium, as we deeply rethink teacher education practices, calling into question our assumptions about what is pedagogy, who is a teacher, and the commitments and praxis for a freedom-based teacher education project. Education as a practice of freedom, Bell Hooks writes, is teaching in a way that anyone can learn. This morning, we continue to inform this conversation with legal and critical education perspectives. And by the end of the panel, we generate several ideas for action here in Greater Pittsburgh. As we are viewing a recorded session today, the question function in Zoom is disabled. The panel discussion does include a rich question and answer portion. However, if we do not get to your question, email us at q.pitt.edu. That is cue.pitt.edu, and we'll respond. I want to thank our School of Education and Center for Urban Education staff for their support in bringing this to you today. Our supportive Renee and Richard Goldman Dean, Dr. Valerie Kinlock, YWCA for their co-sponsorship of today's event, my colleague, Dr. Generett, for the important dialogue, and you for attending today. At the end of the event, I'll be back to close us out and share additional opportunities for learning and engagement, so hang on. And now, here is our October Lunch and Learn, Censorship and the Attack on Critical Race Theory.
On race. Today's topic is extremely important to me, not only as CEO of YWCA Greater Pittsburgh, but also as the child of a mother who sat in on lunch counters to integrate them in Augusta, Georgia. Today, we are talking about censoring racism in American history. When we think about the racial wealth gap, continued and persistent racial residential segregation, differences in opportunity and access to those opportunities, we also must underscore the importance of racism, structural and systematic, within our history as a nation. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Thank you so much for you joining us today. And I also want to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield and Allegheny Health Network, and acknowledge additional support from People's Gas. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mel Stephen Koznick, who is serving as our interim director for YWCA Center for Race and Gender Equity.
Thank you, Angela. And again, I echo her welcome to all of our audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. We think we're going to have a very dynamic conversation. As I give you a preview of what we'll talk about, if we could perhaps go ahead and launch the poll. We have a couple of survey questions that we're going to ask everybody to take today, one at the beginning and one at the end. Your participation helps us improve future community action conversations. If you're following or joining us on Zoom, please keep an eye on the chat where you can learn more about our panelists and some of the subjects that we'll discuss. And it's where you can also post questions. We will take your questions, address them during the second half of the hour today, but feel free to drop them in at any point. As the YWCA, I'd like to thank you for joining us for the Community Action Conversation, where today we will examine efforts, both new and long-term, to suppress facts about the historical existence and impact of systemic racism in the United States. The mission of YWCA Greater Pittsburgh is eliminating racism and empowering women, and we believe that institutional racism has been present in this nation since the historic era of colonization. Racism continues to plague every modern American institution, including education, healthcare, legal justice, and so much more. Our national YWCA roots date back to 1858, over 150 years. Like many American organizations, our history includes programs and facilities that were once segregated. Acknowledging this impact of racism within our own YWC legacy is part of our commitment and leadership as an anti-racist, multiracial women's social justice organization. We strive to make sure that our YWCA mission is more than just a logo at the top of a letterhead. And speaking personally as a white anti-racist accomplice, part of today's discussion will address our individual and collective obligation to present history in a way that is factual and just and equitable, and to critique and challenge ongoing racism. There are no hall passes here. We all need to do the work. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to have some wonderful conversation with our two panelists. I'm honored to introduce them. Dr. Gretchen Givens Generett is Dean and Professor at the School of Education at Duquesne University. She's also the President-elect of the American Educational Studies Association. Dr. T. Elon Dancy is Executive Director at the Center for Urban Education and the Helen S. Faison Endowed Chair in Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome, both of you.
Hi there. Good to be here.
Thank you so much. So today we're here to talk about the presentation of history and whether or not we're seeing an increased effort to censor the racism within our historical past and our current sort of life living experiences. But this conversation about what students should and shouldn't be learning isn't new. However, lately there has been a great deal of media and local coverage nationally about critical race theory in our K through 12 schools and in our colleges and universities. There seems to be some confusion and some curiosity about just what exactly critical race theory is and isn't. So I was hoping that both of you could share with us, and Dr. Generett, we'll start with you. What is critical race theory?
Thank you, Mel, for the timely question, and to Angela and the YWCA for the kind invitation to be here today. Critical race theory rejects the idea that there are differences in races based upon science, and we believe that the view around racial identities is a social construct. Not surprisingly, we also believe that the legal system has played a central and important role in the process of this social construction in American history. And that you can look through the nation's long history as a slave society where it makes whiteness a valuable property right. And in doing so, really denigrates other racial identities. When we think about this, it's paramount to understand that this view of race relations is closely aligned with democratic politics in our country, and that whites' strong desire to shore up and protect the privileged position as a result of our history is central to the analysis around critical race theory. You should note, and it is an important note here, knowing that we're coming live from Pittsburgh, that the father of critical race theory was born in 1930. I'm talking about Derek Bell, was born in 1930 in Pittsburgh's Hill District. And he attended Duquesne University, where I am, and graduated here as an undergraduate, and then went on to attend law school at the University of Pittsburgh, where Dr. Dancy is, in 1957, where he was the only Black graduate at that time. It's important to know that his work comes from his experiences, and central to that understanding is that racial inequality is a normal function of our society and in our systems, and that remains today.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dancy, would you like to add any insights to that, and or even perhaps also address why has this become such a hot button topic?
Sure. I don't want to repeat much of what has been said, because I think Dr. Generett did an excellent job. Dean Generett did an excellent job. And I also want to just reiterate my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to the conversation today. It's a very important conversation. And I want to say that I have a great deal of admiration and respect for Dean Generett. So it's great to be alongside her in this conversation. I think I might just underscore what she said briefly, just to say that what theory does is it explains, it describes, it predicts. And critical race theory is urging us to look at the law through the lens of racism, that actually it is racism that can help us understand the law. And Dean Generett reviewed those 4 features. I just would underscore that, the theory argues that racism is ordinary. It is the status quo. It is not the departure from the normal. It is the normal state of things. And it's precisely this ordinariness that makes racism difficult to address. The interest convergence principle, the idea that policies that people think are progressive continue to serve the interests of whites and white elites. And one of the policies that Derek Bell and others talk about consistently is Brown versus Board of Education. We may have an opportunity to talk about that further down the line. But in general, there is a thinking about that policy as progressive, but he points out to us, and many point out the ways that policy continue to serve the interests of whites and white elites in ways that we see within schools and schooling today. It's important just to reiterate that race is not a biological category. As Dean Generett mentioned, it is socially constructed. So people are not born white and Black, but assigned these categories based on certain factors. And these categories are meant to convey assumptions of desirability and value. And then I want to just remind us about a 4th assumption of critical race theory, that in order to understand the law and in order to understand policies and practices, we have to understand it from the standpoint of people who experience the law from its underside. We have to center the unique experiences and perspectives of those who are dying by the law, not those who are living by it. And so then you ask this question about critical race theory as an issue right now. What is it really about? I appreciate this question because I think it begs us to situate the current attack within a history of attacks on critical curriculum and schooling that is about critical race theory today, but was about Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, yesterday, and required Black history courses for all students, school board fights about textbooks. Those have been with us for a long time. And I think what is an important intervention in this conversation is to see that these are all connected assaults on critical pedagogy and meant to censor any talk of race and racism at all. And, it's not just critical race theory. That's one of the catchphrases. But, cancel culture, wokeism, identity politics that I'm seeing tossed around in various conversations are also rhetoric for the same goal. And it's a reminder for me about how schools are a fundamental site for power and control within an American empire. Critical pedagogy seeks to raise all of our political consciousness within white supremacist systems that see this as a threat. So some of the bills that are being introduced in states, for instance, don't name critical race theory at all. That's why I think it's important for us to have this larger analysis of critical pedagogy. Rather, some of these bills are talking about banning instruction that makes students, and we can read students as white students, feel ashamed or feel attacked. So basically any curriculum that is seeking to tell the truth about an American project in relation to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other people of color is an attack in the current moment.
Yeah. And if I could add, Mel, that the attack that Dr. Dancy is speaking of here, it is intentional. It is a well-organized crusade to diminish and devalue the brand of critical theory. There's been decades of academic literature in different fields related to critical race theory that talk about the possibilities of it. The drive to have it associated with those things that are negative is the underbelly of progress, if you will, right? It is what we see happens as schools become more integrated, or as people move into neighborhoods that have historically remained segregated. And so what you see is the mischaracterization of a theory. And I bring up Derek Bell as being from here because it's also a mischaracterization in my mind of the important work and the way in which he lived his life as well.
Mm-hmm. And if I may, Mel, just add, I think it's important for the current moment that we remember the history of Donald Trump's executive order on the eve of losing the presidency. So, when we're thinking about how is it that this phrasing of critical race theory, enters the zeitgeist at this time. Well, on the eve of losing the presidency, Donald Trump issued an executive order that banned, quote, diversity and race sensitivity training, end quote, in government agencies, including all government spending related to any training on critical race theory. And so pundits argue that he was prompted by a conservative on Fox News who had used this phrase of critical race theory programs in government as a cult of indoctrination. And so then after that ban, we see Tom Cotton, a Republican senator in Arkansas, introduce a bill to ban the teaching of critical race theory in the military, and actually at that time called it racist, when actually critical race theory is a deep examination of racism.
Yeah.
Yes. And he's referred to, racist, reverse racist. And then we see Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida ban critical race theory from being covered in Florida's public schools for, quote, teaching kids to hate their country and each other, end quote. And so the ruse of this, it isn't covered in schools. So actually what is happening politically, that's not largely the political education needed to understand that is not covered in schools. But it is important that we understand what is happening because it is dangerous in its effect on critical and culturally responsive pedagogy.
Thank you both for so thoroughly addressing how critical race theory is one specific branch of theory that has become a catch-all term to really, as you say, censor the factual presence of racism throughout all of our institutions, historically and present, ongoing, and that it's really part of the white supremacist culture that is advancing this censorship, this challenge. The YW was quite impacted by the banning of essentially diversity training or anti-racism education. We work with a lot of organizations providing racial justice education, and they were suddenly very nervous about their federal grants being canceled because they wanted to engage in cultural competence training or, discussions that helped highlight how racism has a very modern and continued impact on all people. So thank you for clarifying that, because I think it is really very murky waters to wade through sometimes. We've seen local examples where, a local K through 12 school, an independent school, fired quite a few of their teachers and their head administrator. So this is something that's happening not just at a local level, not just at a national level in some, theoretical, off map place, but right in our own backyard. So another question I'd like to ask is, you've talked about how specifically there have been methods of suppression. We've seen legislation passed at the state level. We've also seen some school boards go in and ban words like racism and oppression from historical curricula and from educational curricula. Are there any other ways that you can highlight maybe implicit and explicit forms of censorship? We've seen some very explicit examples that you've shared, this banning of teaching, making certain subjects forbidden. But this is, again, not a new occurrence. We've seen this happen over many years. Can you share an additional, maybe less blatant examples that have taken place that minimize racism within our curricula? And maybe even also differentiate what's happening in K through 12, versus what's happening in higher ed. So, Dr. Generett, could you please start us off with that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think the commitment to color blindness and focus on intent as opposed to impact is central to this conversation. So when we talk about what's subtle and what is overt, I think it's really important to use a theory like critical race theory and to really dissect and understand it, because it actually helps us understand the ways in which oppression works across different sectors, whether it's sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of those things. When you look at something through the lens of how policy and laws have been used, critical race theory provides, a framework for helping us think about that. And so when you ask what are some of the implicit ways or explicit ways, I think what I see a lot and hear a lot is the individual fear that people have to have conversations and to study things in the classroom. And I'm talking specifically about teachers. They have done the hard work, like the work that you all do at the YWCA. They've trained over years, and they know how this has impacted their classes. And so one of the ways in which I see the subtlety of it is for individual teachers who have invested time and attention to improving their particular spaces as educators. I've seen them be bullied, right, by parents. And I've also heard that there have been students who feel authorized to just say a word or two to let the teacher know that he or she is on notice. I think so that's at the individual level. At the systemic level, I think that happens as well within systems. And I think your example is an excellent one. I have heard over and over again how people are afraid for their bottom lines. And you can imagine the impact of that during COVID, when people are particularly emotionally, spiritually, and financially, impacted by those kinds of bullying practices. But I think the biggest pieces have been around, for me individually, hearing the stories that teachers who have been working in their spaces to eradicate racism through their curriculum, the impact of that on their own mental well-being and on the actions that they feel safe in taking.
Thank you.
So for me, I think I would respond in two ways, very much agreeing with what Dr. Generett is saying, and also to respond to the point that you're making, Mel, about these outright bans. So we know that critical pedagogy and teaching about racism in America, that is censored in a variety of ways. We've talked about it in this conversation thus far in terms of outright bans or bans that have the effect of the dismantling or the erasure of critical pedagogy. But the decisions that boards make about textbooks that get used in courses are other examples. Those are long fights. I know that James Lowen just passed away, who was a historian who wrote the popular book Lies My Teacher Told Me, where he critically examined 12 popular American high school history books and argued that they were propagating false Eurocentric mythologized views of history. I think myself, I didn't truly know how to understand the issues around the Civil War until I was in college, until I attended, a historically Black college and university and was able to read and have conversations that allowed for me to understand what was the relationship of the enslavement to the Civil War and how that predisposed the kind of conditions that we are experiencing today. I think a second way I would respond to your question is that we can't let these bans, these kinds of theatrical events distract us from an analysis of the current state of schooling as always and, already problematic and equitable, white supremacist, patriarchal, sexist, and, just the matrix of domination systems that we see apparent within them. So we actually, I think, through critical race theory, have this analysis of racism as normalized. So if racism is normalized, then we have to also acknowledge the ways that it is normalized within schools. And, Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate told us this in a Touchstone article that was toward a critical race theory of education, that we can understand school inequities through the tenets of the theory, through the arguments of the theory, particularly the relationship of race and property in America and how that plays out in schools. So CRT in education scholarship observes that property relates to education in implicit and explicit ways. So just think about it like this. Those who have better property are entitled to better schools, right? So still where we live, which, we have to have an analysis of what people call generational wealth. But if you come out of context of having always had access to hoarded resources, then you are entitled to better schools. If those hoarded resources were on the back of your ancestors, then you are sort of contained within dilapidated schools and subjugated schools. Curriculum as a form of intellectual property, we already see this. Curriculum varies with the property values of the school. So what is accessible in terms of content and curriculum in a school that is suburban is different than what is accessible within an urban school. And urban itself, as Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate have argued, is another way of understanding Black or the subjugated other. So again, that's just the idea of what we can study, varying based on whether or not we have better property. And we know that in this country, historically and contemporaneously, white people have access to better property, and that's across class. Even when we think about the differences between white and Black poor, there are differences in wealth and likelihood for wealth and resources through the lifespan. I just want to underscore that the richness of intellectual property delimits our opportunity to learn, and this gets undergirded by real property. So on the one hand, we're talking about the kinds of subjects that might be available. So are your options for a foreign language limited to 2 in an urban school? And do you have access to 8 or 9, foreign languages in a suburban school? That gets undergirded by real property, the labs, the computers, the state-of-art technologies that are distinctive between the two contexts. So schools that serve poor students of color are unlikely to access these resources and therefore have little to no opportunity to learn, despite the attempt to mandate various ed standards. And so that's a reality that critical race theory in education has helped us to call out. We also see in schools rights of disposition, right? So that's a way that they talk about how rewards get tied to white norms in schools, and how the cultural practices of Black and brown people get sanctioned in schools. So dress codes, hair policing, behaviors, communication practices, we still see those as differently engaged, and for some students, disengaged or carcerally engaged in schools. The rights to use and enjoyment, which is about whiteness allowing for certain privileges, through the curriculum and the facilities, for instance. Whose curriculum is most reflected in the core curriculum, whose histories are most reflected, and whose are an elective that might be largely available only to a certain niche or those students who are deemed exceptional. Also, there are facilities differences that I pointed out. Urban schools often associated with a lack of status, not having the reputation of suburban white schools. And then what we've known historically is that when urban school students have been bused to or moved to suburban schools, then those schools lose their reputation. And then there's also the idea of absolute right to exclude, which is an idea that's in critical race theory and education scholarship, which is about the kind of tracking systems that we see in schools, the actual forms of resegregations that we see taking place in a so-called desegregated context that looks like, after Brown versus Board of Education, a movement around gifted and talented, and a gifted and talented that looks like a wider, kind of representation of white students from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds, and then students who are Black and brown, people of color who are understood as learning disabled. Vouchers, school choice more broadly, all of these are forms of resegregations that critical race theory is helping us to call out. And then, of course, there's always the absence of Black instruction, the absence of Black knowledge traditions, many of which we saw prior to a Brown versus Board of Education. And CRT has helped us to understand how education law has actually worked to preserve the interests of whites there in the dismantling, the eradication of Black knowledge traditions and the elimination of Black educators from U.S. schools.
Thank you. You both bring up such great points. And Dean Generett, what you say about educators fearing for their livelihood has been echoed by Jordan in our audience, who points out that a local school district recently put a Black teacher on disciplinary alert for talking about race and equity in Spanish class. And Dr. Dancy, your points about generational wealth and the ability of school districts to have different equipment, different resources based on their tax bracket, very, very relevant today. There's a great TED Talk, if anyone wants to check it out. It's called Lucky Zip Codes. I highly recommend it if you want to learn more about the concepts of generational wealth. So one of the reasons we're here today is to talk about action steps. YWCA firmly believes that when we empower ourselves with knowledge, like we're doing here today, you're sharing great points with us, that one of our next steps needs to be to take direct action to oppose racism, to interrupt oppression, to call for, again, legislation, education, curriculum that is just and equitable. Can you share with us what are some different action steps that everyone can take, small and large, individually, as groups, to prevent or combat the suppression of facts and truth within our school districts, within our universities? And Dr. Generett will, I keep bungling your name, Generett. Can you start us off with a few strategies?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Dr. Dancy outlined very explicitly the issues around critical race theory and its application to education. And I think what we have to understand is that the system is designed to get the results that it's getting, and it's a hyper individualized system, right? So we look at success and excellence based upon these very individual notions and achievements. And we know that this is a collective experience. And so in that system, what is being perpetuated to us as, success of white students is designed for those individuals collectively to be successful. And it's not the case for students of color. So when we think about that, I think it is important, because I believe in personal narratives and stories. I think it is important for us to be aware of and mindful and interrogate our personal experiences. I think we need to do that within the context of systems and trend data. Like, we need to understand larger context and the impacts of schools. And so when we look at a school district, you talk about the TED Talk lucky zip codes. What's happening in that system, right, that allows for however people are defining excellence and success, what's happening in that? And so when you say, what can we do individually? I think it's important to look at our individual personal experiences and to delve into those narratives, but to do so within the context of larger data sets. And I just don't think people are, part of the impact of censorship is that we don't get the full scope of the larger data set, right? So if you censor parts of history, Dr. Dancy talks about, I didn't learn the full impact of the Civil War. Well, that means that he was thinking of his own personal lived experiences without the full context of history. And I think it becomes critically important. I mean, I grew up in right outside of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And like Dr. Dancy, I also attended a historically Black college. And trust me, what I was taught about Confederate soldiers and the capital of the Confederacy was so extraordinarily different from history books that I had access to when I graduated, right? And that was me having access to larger sets of data, larger information, ways in which I could begin to use what I'd learned, right, in this with a critical lens to think about what impact does this have on my lived experience. And I think that those are the kinds of things we have to do. People need to read scholarship by people of color. We've been doing it since the beginning of time. You need to think about, who am I reading about when it comes to my understanding of race? You need to also listen to student experiences. When you talk about what are the actions like, listen to young people. Youth have a lot to say about this, about their experiences in school. They are doing theory in the moment, right? It hasn't been published, right? It doesn't have all the references, but they're talking about their lives in theory. And so I think when we talk about action steps, it is about moving beyond your own understandings to think about how those understandings connect, not just with individuals, but also in a larger context of history.
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Oh, you're muted.
You know, it's so funny. As long as we've been doing these Zoom talks, I still never got used to that mechanism. I still always forget to unmute myself. So I'm trying, to make sure that there's no background noise that interrupts our conversation. But I appreciate what Dean Generett said. So much about the reading and the study. And I want to underscore that point because of the way that many communities tend to think about study as somehow the enemy of action. Study itself is a form of action. And what we're talking about are the ways that political education is under siege. And so if we know that political education is it important, which it perhaps we don't know that, but I'm here to say that political education is important for us to map a pathway toward self-determination for the least of these, for sure, and for any freedom strategies. We have to have political education. In order to have political education, that means we have to study. And so I want to just underscore the point about study, but also to add that we have to develop the courage to get into organized struggle with groups that are committed to Black and Indigenous self-determination and education for liberation. So again, about this idea of study, what study is a commitment to deeply understanding the political conditions of schooling, many of which we've talked about today, and then the power relationships that continue to recompose themselves every generation. And then second, struggle as an education purpose requires us to develop the courage for confronting, disrupting, and resisting unjust constraints. And this latter part, we may not be able to get there and probably should not get there until we are doing some deep and focused study. And it also requires remembering that we are agents, right? So we're not just passive here or just victims. But when I look at the history of my ancestry, of course, I see people who had to survive the horrors of enslavement, the horrors of a Jim Crow, currently surviving the horrors of police brutality and redlining and mass incarceration, but I also see agency everywhere we turn. When I look at the Black Lives Matter movement, when I look at what various families and communities are doing, within our own local hill districts and Homewood, I see agency everywhere around us. So I think the task becomes how do we study our current political conditions and then organize with freedom-minded communities, other freedom-minded communities toward these action strategies. What I might also add is that through study, we're refusing the rampant anti-intellectualism around us. So when people are throwing these phrases at us about critical race theory as racist and woke culture and identity politics, we have to be able to understand what that means in relationship to power. And this is by and large an education that, state institutions for which schools are not preparing us to be able to do. But, anti-intellectualism is all around us. Examples include, institutional pandemic practices. We're seeing them even right now, within and across institutions that are prioritizing profit over people, and then state attacks on critical race theory, and then critical pedagogies. And I'm reminded of some words that I think Rachel Herzing has written this. Rachel Herzing is director of the Center for Political Education. That study, again, is a form of action. So that's just sort of a way that I am in this work personally, but I also might add as a director of a Center for Urban Education, the idea of study and organized struggle is programmatized in the center. Like that is the large thrust of what we're doing in the center. So, we would invite folks here, and I hope this is not intended to be a shameless plug by any means, but if you're looking for opportunities for study of the political conditions of schools and schooling, I certainly would invite you to the Center for Urban Education's events. We're having monthly talks, and our talks over the last year have included, movements for Black Black power in schools, Black independent schooling movements, scholars who have studied the policing of hair within schools from indigenous knowledge traditions. We have talked with people who have helped us understand the relationship between schooling and carcerality. This is the kind of political education that we're devoted to in the center, and that we would encourage people to join us in thinking and reading. And I think finally, even for those of us who have read, scholarship, have read books or articles that we think are important, there is nothing stopping us from returning to those, to rereading, to rethinking, to continue, to question. And then there are always more work that we can be reading. But I think what I want to highlight again, and hopefully not ramble more, is just to underscore the importance of study, and to study with collectives who are interested in radical transformation of education structures and systems.
And Mel, if I could just say, Dr. Dancy's point about struggle is, I think, central to some of this pushback, right, on and censorship of talking about race. Schools have been designed, and other systems have been designed to create, to take away struggle for certain groups of people. And so learning is not supposed to be hard. Learning is not supposed to create dissonance, if you will, for certain students. And that's how the systems have been designed. So if you bring in these materials, right, and if you ask people to study materials that cause dissonance in ways that challenge you and force you to create a type of metabolism that goes against the grain in any way, which we quite honestly ask Black and brown kids to do all the time. If we're doing that for white students, then that becomes a problem. But what Dr. Dancy is saying is that to get to the next level of anything that's worthwhile, it requires you to push through that struggle. Mm-hmm. And if we remove that out of the way, then we miss the opportunity of our learning in that process.
Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you something that inspires me. Just one more point, if I may, Mel. Something that inspires me so much about Pittsburgh, again, which is a context in which Derek Bell developed and undoubtedly was, referring to some of his educational societal realities in Pittsburgh as he was like forefathering this theory, is look at the organized struggle that's happening locally. I mean, there's so many groups. There's like Gwen's Girls, there are organized groups of Black educators who have been studying the education conditions of Black children for years. What are the opportunities, to study with them and to support that work, to be in solidarity with them? There's a historical Pittsburgh Freedom Schools movement, right? And we know that freedom schools, in connection with SNCC, which goes, back within civil rights, and now the Children's Defense Fund, organizes schooling on the principles that Dr. Generett was talking about in terms of the importance of education being for the collective, being for a collective justice, a collective freedom, and that anything that is being taught must be taught in order to teach others, and must be taught so that people, especially those who are living on the underside, are actually prepared to struggle against the conditions of unfreedom that characterize their experiences. So I just wanted to, shout out some organized groups that are here locally, and if not those, there are others.
Yeah.
Thank you for those examples. It does take definite strategy and deliberate action. It can't happen accidentally. And there are lots of great organizations, lots of historical models to follow, but also powerful new social media actions coming out that, the younger generations have learned to use new tools to create new forms of resistance.
Yeah.
I'd like to quickly share a couple of comments and questions that have come in. We do have a couple of audience questions, but one member of the audience shared that a local school district, this is from David, has rather confusingly both banned the 1619 project and Holocaust denialism, which they seem to think is the same thing, which it is not. And then we also have a comment that students have reported teachers deliberately skipping over certain incidents in history that seem either, again, implicit or explicit. It's hard to tell, but an excising of racism from the presentation of history.
Yeah, and I think that is critical, right? So one of the things that I jotted down here is don't forget how assessment is done and standardized testing and what's on those tests. Like, that's a big part of the curriculum censorship that Dr. Dancy referred to. And so the notion that you could skip something in the text, right, is doesn't happen if it has been valued at this other level, because it's going to be assessed. And again, that's how we're going to determine whether or not your district is excellent or not, right? So you see it at every level, right? What is being tested and how that gets centralized in a way that excludes people. And so this is why out of school time places and spaces in the city and in Pittsburgh and in other cities become so important, because they can do the kinds of work that we're talking about in ways that feel like there's less bullying related to what I said, for teachers who are trying to do the good work, who are trying to put up the good fight. And I would say that's also for school building leaders as well. And so I would add to Gwen's girls and the freedom schools that Dr. Dancy mentioned. I would add One Hood Media to that. They're doing extraordinary work in neighborhoods and related to voting and schooling and supporting gaps in technology as well. So is Girls Gov, right? They're also doing important and significant work relating to getting more girls' voices and women's voices in politics in the state of Pennsylvania. It is amazing how few women we have in legislation in this state, and so there again is an intentional support of that political understanding and civic engagement, which connects personal stories to trend data, and so. I think it becomes important, and schools I think districts need to understand that they're missing the opportunity, because students are going to demand that they get information that will allow them to be members of the world. I read somewhere, in thinking about these examples that are in the chat, that when Professor Bell left Harvard, and they weren't teaching the course that he was teaching on race and critical theory, students organized and students brought in speakers so that they could continue learning. And that's what students will do. And that's the missed opportunity when we talk about engagement and efficacy and motivation and all of these things in schools. Well, I will put that back on schools and say, how are you engaging students in this critical moment so that they feel that school is the place that's pouring into them and not just where they're being asked to pour out.
Mm-hmm. We've had a question come in. There have been a couple. We'll try to get to, or do our best to get to all of them. But Jennifer shared that she was disappointed to learn that her own children's school district did not participate in some recent diversity training through Pitt for teachers and administrators. And she's curious, do local school districts typically seek diversity or cultural competency or racial justice training? And, how widespread is it?
Well, I mean, I know that that's specifically for Pitt, but I'll jump in real quick and I'll let Elon give you those numbers. But I will say, in my experience, it has not been full districts. It has been individuals who seek it out. I think it takes a special type of leadership, and I would say courageous leadership for leaders to do that work. But I will.
Yes.
Stop talking.
So the center, one bucket or area of work within the Center for Urban Education is actually anti-racist education. There are a number of programs that we hold every year. So, for instance, we hold a Summer Educators Forum, and the Summer Educator Forum is about principles of critical pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy. And historically, we've had individual teachers from across Metro Pittsburgh who were seeking to improve their practice in relationship to these principles join us. But there's never been an overwhelming call from school districts, not by any means. So, and I think that's an important analysis to have. Prior to, the critical race theory, this current sort of moment of critical race theory attack and 1619 attack, that there was a kind of never that we saw in history, this outcry or insistence upon critical pedagogical training for teachers from school districts.
Yeah, and I jumped in there because I know that I have intentionally suggested to leaders and districts to take advantage of the offerings, and it hasn't.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, and this goes back to the bullying point that Dr. Generett made. There are professors and teachers who have faced death threats. Their home addresses and phone numbers and emails have been leaked. They've risked the safety of their families. And so maybe some folks aren't at the place where they can have a public demonstration yet, or a public stance against, defying a ban in their school district. Is there merit? This is a question from Ariel. Is there merit in private conversations, in having small group discussions, and in starting there in ways that maybe are less physically dangerous to people? I think of teachers and professors of color in particular who have faced, white supremacist death threats.
Well, if I may, Dr. Generett, I think so. I think that's always been the history of struggle, that people got together, organized privately, to study political conditions of schooling, and also determined based on the realities how to protect the safety of a collective. So there may be, people come to collectives from different standpoints. Some of us might be administrators. When I think about traditional ways that communities organize, sometimes you have people from faith-based institutions, you had parents, you had, neighborhood caregivers, and you had people from various walks of life who were coming together to study. And part of that organization was about determining who also needed to do what. And how the struggle might be a collective struggle together. And if there needs to be an individual, who might need to be the individual in order to do this? And what needs to be said, and what are the forms of data that need to be presented in order to advocate for a particular policy change? So that goes back to the point that we were making about study. So the ways we know how to move forward is if we're, to study the radical traditions of people who come before us, who were doing that work.
Yeah, and it's happening in Pittsburgh, right? So I'm not sure who asked the question, but there are those small groups. There are small groups of white allies having those conversations and working with white members of the community who are interested. There are Asian allies who are doing it. So it is happening in small groups. And I think what's important is what I have found is when people are invested and wanting to transform their ways of thinking to do the type of study and struggle that Dr. Dancy spoke about, there are spaces here in Pittsburgh where you can do that. The thing that I know we need to work towards more is how do we do that collectively in ways that there's synergy to work together on, right? And I think it's just everything that we do, it's so heavy. There's such a weathering of our mind, bodies, and spirits because there's always so much work at it. But those things are happening in small groups, and we could, the challenge is always just how do we collectively get together in ways that move the systems in bigger ways. But I am always encouraged by the work that's being done in those small groups by folks in Pittsburgh.
Thank you. We've also had Linda has referenced the Abolitionist Teaching Network as one of the sort of examples of pushback against trying to censor critical race theory. So that's a good example. There are lots of good things to read and watch out there. If you do want to start a small group, the writings and work of Dr. Nicole Hannah-Jones are really great. She's faced her own sort of repercussions for being such a strong advocate. She was involved in the 1619 Project and writes a lot about reparations as well, which is a subject that I recommend folks spend some time. We've got just a minute or two. Are there any final resources either of you would like to recommend before we do? And everybody, please stay tuned in for our poll question. Any final authors or other resources? Just one or two quick ones that you would recommend, either one of you.
Sure. So I would love to just shout out Homewood Children's Village, which is another organization that is doing excellent education work. There's also Sisters Pittsburgh, Ciora Thomas. Who else? I think I would also recommend that our Pitt Ed Justice Collective in the School of Education host reading groups all the time, critical film viewings. There was a group there is a group that has emerged for white practitioners, even white people who would like to think more critically about whiteness and sort of the invention of whiteness and its relationship to an American project. That is ongoing within the Pitt Ed Justice Collective. So if people would go to the School of Education website for the University of Pittsburgh, you can find the Pitt Ed Justice Collective, and there are always events that are being uploaded. And feel free to register and attend. And also, please go to the Center for Urban Education website at qcue.pitt.edu to learn more about our events as well.
Yeah, and I would just say here at Duquesne, we have the UCA Center for Educational Leadership and Social Justice, and that's connected to the UCEA organization nationally. I would also say that thinking about the resources that Dr. Dancy talked about, I'm giving a shout out for the summer program or the summer work that he does. I think it's extraordinary. And so if any of you on the call can get your school districts as a whole to go, I think, one of the powerful pieces of prior to coming to Duquesne, I taught in a program where you had to apply as a cohort from your school district. And it was so powerful to have that common learning experience together. And I really appreciate the way that has been designed for districts to come. And so I would encourage you to do that.
Thank you both for those resources. As a former high school history teacher and social studies teacher, I always advocate for lifelong learning. And those are wonderful resources to add to our list. I'd also like to just put in our own little plug. This is one of our ongoing series every Wednesday. We meet here, and I invite everybody to join us in October, on October 20th, where we will talk about male allies and white accomplices as part of our annual Week Without Violence. We'll specifically be looking at the intersection of gender, race, and violence, which is, again, has deep historic roots in the United States. So thank you both, Dr. Dancy, Dr. Generett, for your wonderful expertise and just also down-to-earth and practical suggestions today as well. I would also like to thank our presenting sponsor, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield and Allegheny Health Network, and acknowledge additional support from People's Bat Gas. Please take the opportunity. The poll question has popped up in your screen. Please do complete that so that we can continue to improve our action conversations on race. Thank you again for joining us and to our special guests. And I also want to thank all of my colleagues who have made the magic work behind the scenes.
Yes.
Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
An important conversation indeed. Our thanks to our Pitt School of Education and Center for Urban Education team, particularly Greg Latshaw. I just want to share with you that we're not done yet. As a follow-up to today's Lunch and Learn, please join us for more thinking and learning about critical race theory in education. Very soon, you will receive an email from the Center for Urban Education inviting you to 2 more talks that you can immediately access. The first is Critical Race Theory and the Black Radical Tradition, Engaging with Structural Racism in Education, featuring Sabina Vaught, our Pitt School of Education's Department Chair for Teaching, Learning, and Leading, and Center for Urban Education affiliate faculty, and Dr. Paul Warmington, Professor of Education Studies at Warwick University. The second is What is Critical Race Theory and Why is it under attack? Featuring Kimberly Crenshaw, Professor of the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and a Chief Architect of Critical Race Theory, and Devin Carbado, Professor of Law, also at UCLA School of Law. Finally, know that we regularly update our website. Go to q.pitt.edu, that's cue.pitt.edu to sign up for our listserv so you can receive news about our events and other projects. While you're on our website, check out our most recent newsletter where you can